In terms of economical aspects, I mean, you should be familiar with this slide at this point. Clearly, the EU, Europe, is not homogeneous in terms of access to factor replacement therapy. And this is from the survey we did last year at EHC, looking at the factor VIII use per capita compared to GDP per capita. You can see an enormous variation from 0.1 to 8.56 IU per capita for factor VIII, and indeed in the EU from 0.51 to 8.56 within just the EU countries, varying from Romania at the lower end to Sweden at the higher end. And I think Paul's already alluded to the opportunities that the new long-acting factors will bring to the market. The first submission was made to the FDA in March of last year, and the expectation is that the first of the longer-acting factors will be licensed in the USA and Canada in the first quarter of 2014. They have the potential to dramatically improve treatment and the overall quality of life for patients. You could either maintain higher trough levels than 1%, and we've heard talk of 3%, 5%, even up to 15%. They could facilitate early prophylaxis in children. For children who have difficult venous access or require portacats, perhaps less frequent infusion, reducing the need for portacats or venous access devices, which of course can frequently cause infection. And they can facilitate better management of surgery. And I think they also obviously add greatly to the potential to individualize therapy. The prophylaxis interval can be individualized. You could have on-demand treatment with greater impact, so perhaps a single infusion, which would last longer, would be more effective in treating a bleeding episode. And certainly they could be individualized based on the individual person's PK, their individual half-life, their bleeding pattern. Are they active, or do they sit every evening on the sofa playing with a PlayStation, or are they out playing soccer or running? Their requirement for peaks and troughs during the week, because it's not just a question of the trough level, but also the peaks if they're playing a particular sport a couple of times a week. All of this would be looked at, I think, on an individual basis. Economically, I think if they're introduced and available on a cost-effective basis, then they can possibly transform haemophilia treatment. Of course, if they're introduced as a very high-priced luxury product, which will be available to a small proportion of people with haemophilia in the wealthier developed countries, then they will perhaps transform the quality of life for those patients. But I think if they're to really make a big difference globally, they have to be introduced on a cost-effective basis. And therefore, they have to improve treatment at a sustainable cost. If that happens, if the longer-acting factors achieve their potential, if they come to the market at a sustainable cost, then I think they will mean that the price of the current recombinants may well have to decrease in order to maintain some market share or find new markets. I'm not entirely sure what may happen with the price of the current plasma-derived factors. They may decrease. On the other hand, I'd have had different thoughts about that if the clinical trials for the use of immune globulin in Alzheimer's had been successful, because there was a feeling at that point that you'd need a lot more IVIG, which would mean more plasma-derived factor concentrates available. So I'm not sure what's going to happen there. I don't think anybody actually is. In terms so I think this is an opportunity, not just for the wealthy, developed countries, but also for emerging countries. And we've heard earlier that, of course, despite 20 years of hard work, the proportion of people with haemophilia worldwide who have access to replacement therapy has probably improved from 80% with no access to therapy, maybe now we're talking 70%. That's after 20 years of hard work globally. But if we really want to make a difference, if we really want to see the majority of people with haemophilia having some access to therapy, then it needs to be economically viable. And there are 2 European countries who still routinely use cryoprecipitate as their main therapy for haemophilia A. And despite the fact that the latest EDQM recommendation, which is coming out this year, states that the minimum factor use per capita should be 3 IU per capita, there are 11 European countries still using less than 2, and 4 still using less than 1 IU per capita. So I think in terms of barriers or threats, there are a couple of barriers or threats in terms of the access to new products, the large number of patients required for clinical trials, and the paediatric requirements under the EMA clinical trial guidelines. The consequent delay that this will cause in licensing of new products in Europe, the economic pressures due to the delay in licensing, and the potential for market exclusivity based on orphan drug designation. I think Dr. Bhavandi went through some of this morning in an earlier presentation, but the clinical trial guidelines from EMA now differ significantly from those of FDA. Effectively, in the European Union, you now have to complete your paediatric previously treated patient studies before you can seek marketing approval and licensing for use in adults. And if you're talking longer-acting factors with 50 exposure days, that takes longer. And I think the fact is that we're not just concerned that this will result. This will result in 2 to 3 year delays before products become available to patients. And, you know, I mentioned earlier that we expect the first longer-acting factors to be licensed in the USA and Canada in the first quarter of next year. In Europe, we're looking at 2 years later. We're probably looking at early 2016. And one of my concerns about that is that generally, products are more expensive in the USA. And US prices, the average wholesale prices in the USA are generally higher than Europe. I'm worried that the companies may get a false sense of value of the products, in that sense that the launch prices in Europe may be set excessively high, and that I have no doubt that when the longer-acting 8s and 9s become available in Europe, they will be subjected to HTAs, probably under a centralised mechanism with the new EU HTA network. And if they're found to be too expensive, I'm concerned that governments may not reimburse and we may not have these products available. Now, there were 3 broad new approaches being taken to extending the activity of 8 and 9, and Paul has discussed this. So you've got fusion with the FC portion of human globulin, fusion with albumin, pegylation. I think we welcome all of these approaches. It's not clear to us at this point which of these will result in the best clinical outcomes in the long term. But we need the different approaches, we need the competition. It may well be that 3 or 4 years after these 3 types of products are licensed on the market, that we find that one is preferable to the others, or that one product works better in one subgroup of patients as opposed to another. We just don't know. But our concern is that these products have all received Orphan Designation to help them in their development steps in Europe, but under the orphan drug regulations in Europe, they could all be regarded as similar. And we have a concern that the EMA may view all of these products as one group of products, and that there's a possibility that only the first of the longer-acting 8s and only the first of the longer-acting 9s would receive marketing authorization in Europe to the exclusion of the others. Now, the EHC position was communicated to the EMA about 1.5 years ago on this. We made it very clear that we do not want to see the orphan drug designation used to hinder the development, licensing or the availability of products which have demonstrably different protein modification or enhancement. And we see this market exclusivity could potentially create a monopoly rather than market competition. And I think the orphan designation is entirely welcome for a very rare condition. If you had a factor 5 concentrate, with, then it'd be fantastic to give that orphan designation. But in this situation, to give market exclusivity to one of these products over the others is a real concern. If I go back to the previous slide, their definition of similar relates to if the products have the same principal molecular structure, they're regarded as similar. If they have the same mechanism of action, they're regarded as similar. If they have the same therapeutic indication, they're regarded as similar. Now, I think they do have, all 3 classes of products have the same principal molecular structural features. They have the same therapeutic indication, but they have clearly different mechanisms of action. So in our view, they do not meet the definition of similarity, and they should not be, one of them should not be given market exclusivity over the other classes of products. And if the first of these products receives market exclusivity, then the potential for better products may never be realised, because there won't be any great onus on the companies to continue development or certainly to market in Europe. Patients may be deprived of potentially better options. There'll be no competition, so there'll be higher prices. There'll be no cascading effect on lowering prices for other products. A monopoly, by definition, means no competition, means higher prices. I mean, there's a reason why factor 7A is one of the most expensive drugs in the world, is because for many, many years there was no competition. It would not be the same price if there were 3 of them. In June, the EHC had a high-level meeting with the EMA. We sent a delegation to meet the EMA. Our concerns were taken very seriously, and we sent a delegation led by Professor Bhavandi, Professor Giangrande, Radoslav Kazmarek and Amanda Bock. and they met 19 members of the 6 different EMA committees. They brought them all together in the one room. It was a very full and frank discussion. They were not willing to change the paediatric requirement. They're not willing to change the orphan drug requirement. They point out this is the task of the Commission. They are willing and were willing to engage proactively with the EHC and to formally include the EHC in the ongoing consultation process. And I think if you look at, they also point out that there are 3 types of derogations. So there are 3 exceptions where you may not follow through on market exclusivity. The first is if the first company who get a license waive their right to this, so if they consent not to seek this. The second is if the first company to get a license has an inability to supply the market with sufficient quantities. And the third is if a second medicinal product is safer, more effective, or otherwise clinically superior. Well, the third one is going to be difficult to show if only one's on the market. The second one, I think, is highly unlikely, because if they can supply the market, I'm sure they'll be able to supply sufficient. And I'll just come back to this. Now, I think our view is that if you look at the 3 broad approaches to prolonging the half-life, FC fusion, albumin fusion, pegylation, we would not be unhappy with market exclusivity being given to the first of each of these, the first longer-acting 8 and the first longer-acting 9 with FC fusion, albumin fusion, pegylation. Fair enough, but not to the. It shouldn't be an Olympic Games or race to the finish. Only the first 8 and 9 to cross the line gets market exclusivity. So if you had a subsequent 8 or 9 with the same method of prolongation, then it would have to show a clear, demonstrable clinical superiority in order to achieve a license. But we view these as 3 entirely different approaches and 3 separate classes of products, if you like. And we do not want to see only the first of these getting market exclusivity. That would be disastrous. Now, I think, in fairness, the EMA took the points on board that were made to them at the meeting. That doesn't necessarily mean they'll change their minds. There's regulation and there's common sense and logic, but we'll keep working on this. And just to going back in history a little bit, lessons from the past about price. I can recall vividly the World Congress in 1994 when recombinant factor 8 was becoming available, and it was stated that, and this is a quote from one of these plenaries, that it will be available in large quantities at low cost. Yeah, right. That's worked out well. That hasn't happened because they're seen as premium products and the price has stayed high. And for subsequent improvements, we've seen additional significant cost per unit. And some of the subsequent improvements where companies have sought significant increases in prices have been a nicer box or a better infusion set. Very, minor improvements, if you can call them improvements. I think with the longer acting factors, some quotes I've heard, they should attract a premium price. If it lasts 3 times longer, the unit price could be at least 3 times greater. And these kind of things concern me. These kind of quotes concern me. And I think economically, governments will not pay significantly higher overall costs for more convenient treatment options. If you go to a HTA agency, okay, and you say, hey, this is a factor 9, and you can infuse it once every 10 days rather than twice a week, or this is a factor 8, you can infuse it twice a week rather than 3 times a week. They say, that's nice, but we're not paying more for that, for convenience. So I think, of course, that also leads into, it's not just a question of convenience, it's trough levels, it's clinical management, it's management of bleeding. The cost per unit, I think, could increase, but not by a factor which increases the overall cost per patient. And I strongly believe, and we will be urging the companies to look at different models for costing these products. Don't just look at the unit cost. Look at the overall cost per patient, look at the average annual cost. Be a bit more imaginative in terms of looking at this. And also, it's also going to be very, very difficult to directly compare a unit cost for a longer-acting factor with a current product. So look at the average annual cost. And also, I think I would like to see these products come into the market. I think there's a really exciting potential future here. I'd like to see them come into the market and change in the market, not just becoming a small, expensive niche product, but really coming into the market, with significantly sustainable costs, which at higher volumes, with lower margins, and bring in real change to the global market. And I think these are quotes in relation to HTAs. HTAs should be carried out to assess the cost effectiveness of new health technology against the current standard of care. Now, I think the current standard of care, if and when these products come to the market in Europe, they'll be assessed against the current products for prophylaxis. So I think the comparison that will be made in terms of incremental cost per quality will be how do they compare with the current prophylaxis regime. And this is, I'm indebted to my colleague Declan Noon for putting this slide together for me last week. And basically, I'll just go to the bottom line here, that if you look at the current models and you look at the differences in quality of life using EQ5Ds, if HTA agencies use the current parameters they use to assess these things, then I think anything over an additional cost of €1,500 per patient per year probably won't pass their quality limit at agencies such as NICE in the UK. So I think there is not scope for significant increase in overall cost per patient per year if these products are to make a significant difference in the market. And it must also be realised that if you look at impact on quality of life, we've certainly published studies where we showed that the quality of life of young men on prophylaxis is about, on a scale of 0 to 1, where on-demand gives you a quality of life of perhaps 0.65 to 0.7, prophylaxis can give you a quality of life up to 0.91. Now, the problem with that is that there isn't a big difference between 0.91 and 1, so there is very limited scope for increased utility value and quality of life. So I think that these have to be priced very carefully if they're going to make a major difference in the market. Thank you.